June 9, 1944, Normandy. A thin morning mist crawls over the hedgerows, clinging to the damp earth. The smell of diesel, cordite, and crushed grass fills the air. A column of smoke rises in the distance where a farm once stood. Through his Zeiss binoculars, an SS Panzer officer watches the horizon. A smirk settles beneath the brim of his black cap. He's seen them before, the American Shermans, clumsy and weak. Tommy Cookers, his men call them. Easy prey for the long 88. Across the field, hidden beneath an orchard, a British Sherman Firefly waits. Its 17-pounder gun, long, ungainly, and impossibly large for its turret, rests steady against the trunk of an apple tree. Inside, the crew speaks in quiet tones, their breath short, their hands slick with sweat. 2 kilometers away, the Tiger's turret turns. Its barrel glints under a pale sun. The SS officer laughs. Then, a single flash. A thunderclap rolls across the fields. The Sherman fires from 2,000 yards away, and in that instant, the laughter dies. By 1942, the world had learned to fear the shadow of the Panzer. From the burning sands of North Africa to the rolling fields of France, German armored warfare had rewritten the rules of battle. The names Tiger and Panther carried a kind of mechanical terror, steel beasts designed for domination, not defense. The Allies, despite their industrial strength, were on the back foot. Their tanks, reliable, numerous but outgunned, were built for mobility and production, not for duels. The M4 Sherman, America's workhorse, rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. It was fast, mechanically sound, and easy to repair. But against the Tiger's thick armor and devastating 80mm gun, it was little more than a target. In North Africa, 1942, the British 8th Army first met the Tiger one near Tunis. The encounter was brief and brutal. Shells from 6-pounder guns ricocheted off the German tank's hull like stones thrown at a fortress. Crews watched in disbelief as their rounds bounced harmlessly, while the Tiger's counterfire ripped through them with surgical precision. The reports that followed were grim, nothing short of despair written in military language. Back in London and Washington, engineers and commanders faced an urgent truth. The Allies had no tank capable of facing German armor head-on. The Tiger could kill from over a mile away. The Sherman, by contrast, had to close to half that distance to even have a chance. The Sherman's design philosophy had been shaped by earlier wars: mobility over might, reliability over raw power. It was meant to fight as part of a combined force, relying on artillery and air support to soften the enemy before closing in. But the battlefield had evolved. The Germans no longer retreated. They waited, dug in, and slaughtered advancing columns. In the wake of the Dieppe raid and the North African campaign, British analysts began charting every encounter. They saw a pattern. Allied tanks could win only when they outnumbered the enemy, sometimes 10 to 1. The cost in men and machines was unacceptable. Something had to change. By early 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, a quiet arms race began behind the front lines. British ordnance officers studied captured Tigers and Panthers, measuring armor thickness, slope angles, and firing ranges. They realized that no existing Allied gun, not the American 75mm, not the British 6-pounder, could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at practical battle ranges. The solution, if it existed, had to come from within British ingenuity. The answer lay in a gun already in development, the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. It was a monster of a weapon, designed initially for anti-tank guns towed by artillery crews. Its armor-piercing rounds could punch through more than 140 millimeters of steel at 1,000 yards, enough to destroy even a Tiger. But the gun was too long, too heavy, and too powerful for most tanks to carry. Yet war leaves little room for impossibility. In 1943, a small group of British engineers at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment in Fort Halstead began experimenting. Could the 17-pounder be mounted on the Sherman, the one tank the Allies could produce in overwhelming numbers? The Americans doubted it. The turret ring was too small, the recoil too fierce. But the British persisted, hacking, cutting, and redesigning until they found a way. By late that year, a prototype stood in a workshop, a Sherman with its gun replaced by the 17-pounder. The breech barely fit. The radio had to be moved to the rear of the turret. The gunner's seat shifted and ammunition stored wherever it could fit. It was crude, inelegant, and deadly. That improvised design would soon earn a name whispered with pride across Allied lines, the Sherman Firefly. It was not beauty that made it remarkable. It was defiance, steel answering steel. And as Allied planners drew up Operation Overlord, that defiance would become a necessity. The beaches of Normandy would not forgive weakness. The men who would drive those Shermans knew it. In early 1944, deep within British workshops scattered from Lulworth to Woolwich, the race to arm the Sherman with the 17-pounder became an obsession. Every delay meant another crew would face German armor with weapons that could not kill. Every hour lost meant more burnt-out Shermans on European soil. The problem was never just technical, it was philosophical. American doctrine viewed the tank as part of a system, not as the primary tank killer. Dedicated tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine or the M18 Hellcat were supposed to engage enemy armor, while Shermans advanced on infantry and logistics. But the British, who had suffered under German fire since Dunkirk, knew that in Europe the enemy's tanks would come for them, and the Sherman had to be ready to shoot back. The 17-pounder project was officially discouraged by U.S. ordnance. The Americans feared it would delay mass production and disrupt standardization, but the British ignored the warnings. The work continued in secret under Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel Witheridge, a veteran who had lost a leg in North Africa. Their workshop became a forge of improvisation, cutting turrets, welding counterweights, redesigning recoil cylinders. The British engineers forced the gun into the Sherman's turret by rotating the breech sideways, installing a new gun mantlet, and lengthening the barrel far beyond what American designers had imagined possible. When it first fired, the recoil nearly shattered its mount, but it worked. The Firefly was born unofficially at first, officially by mid-1944. The name Firefly wasn't chosen by committee. It was a soldier's nickname, whispered by crews who saw the massive muzzle flash that lit up the fields when it fired at night. A brief, deadly glow before the target vanished in smoke. By D-Day, around 342 Fireflies had been converted and distributed among British and Commonwealth armored units. Each troop of 4 Shermans was issued one Firefly, its long barrel standing out like a spear among its shorter-barreled companions. German snipers soon learned to target it first. Allied crews tried to disguise the gun by painting false muzzle brakes or wrapping it in camouflage nets. The Firefly's gun could pierce a Tiger's frontal armor from 500 meters away, twice the range of the original Sherman's 75mm. For the first time, Allied crews had a chance not just to survive, but to strike first. It was a shift as psychological as it was tactical. In the fields of Normandy, where every hedgerow hid a potential ambush, the Firefly became the tank everyone wanted nearby. Its presence was reassurance, that perhaps this time they wouldn't have to die before seeing their target burn. German reports soon reflected this new threat. Panzer divisions began noting long-barreled Shermans capable of killing from unexpected ranges. Orders circulated to prioritize their destruction. SS units that once laughed at the sight of the squat, mass-produced Shermans now hesitated before exposing their flanks. But the Firefly was never meant to replace the standard Sherman. It was too specialized, too difficult to produce quickly. The Americans continued relying on quantity, overwhelming firepower, air dominance, and mobility, while the British perfected this new hybrid of necessity and brilliance. The Firefly entered combat just as the Allies stormed France. From the beaches of Golden Juno to the Bocage country beyond Caen, it fought against the most fearsome tanks the world had ever seen. Tigers dug in behind stone walls. Panthers crouched at crossroads, ambushing anything that moved. It was in these fields, under the dense green canopy of Normandy, that the legend was forged. Firefly crews learned to fight unseen, using range and patience as their greatest weapons. They hunted the hunters, and when they struck, they did so with surgical precision. Each kill was more than a tactical success. It was revenge for years of inferiority. For the men inside those tanks, every tiger that burned was proof that ingenuity could match arrogance. As June turned to July, and the Allies pushed deeper into occupied France, whispers spread among German units of the British tank that kills from a mile away. It was no longer a rumor. It was a reckoning. and somewhere in the orchards near Villers-Bocage, one SS officer would soon learn the truth of it. The human angle, inside the Firefly inside, the cramped steel shell of a Sherman Firefly. 5 men shared more than space. They shared fear, sweat, and survival. The crew's world was measured in inches. Every motion was deliberate. The loader's quick hands, the gunner's steady eye, the commander's calm voice. The Firefly's 17-pounder gun left little room for comfort. Its massive breech jutted into the fighting compartment, forcing the radio into the turret bustle and ammunition into any crevice that would hold it. The men who served in these machines were not soldiers of myth. They were volunteers, farmers, mechanics, and students turned tankers overnight. They knew what it meant to face a tiger. Many had seen friends lost to them, their tanks burning like torches on open fields. Yet they climbed in again day after day. The Firefly gave them something new, not invulnerability, but a chance. The first time they watched its 17-pounder tear through German armor, there was silence inside the turret. Then disbelief. Then something else. Resolve. Crew accounts from the 13th, 18th Royal Hussars and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers spoke of the same moment. The recoil, the flash, and the sudden realization that they could win. It was no longer a hopeless fight. The Firefly wasn't just a weapon. It was redemption forged in steel. The tactical angle, changing the battlefield before the Firefly, Allied tank tactics in Europe were built on overwhelming numbers. Platoons would swarm enemy armor, hoping to outflank and destroy it before being cut down. It was a grim calculus. Sacrifice one tank to get another into position. The Firefly changed that equation. With its immense range and armor penetration, it could destroy a Panther or Tiger long before those tanks entered effective range. Commanders began positioning Fireflies as overwatch vehicles, hidden behind hedgerows or high ground, covering advancing Shermans. This new dynamic turned every engagement into a deadly chess match. German tank commanders, once confident in their frontal armor, now found themselves hunted. The British had turned their weakest machine into a sniper's weapon. In the bocage of Normandy, this mattered. Visibility was short, fields divided by earthen banks and trees. Every corner could hide a gun barrel. Firefly crews learned to move silently, to use shadows and patience. The moment a Tiger exposed its side armor, they struck. One German officer later wrote in his diary that the enemy's new long gun has made every open field a trap. That fear, the fear of unseen death, began to erode the myth of Panzer. Invincibility. The technological angle. The 17-pounder's genius, the 17-pounder was not just a bigger gun. It was the culmination of British ballistic engineering under desperate conditions. Its round, the APC-BC armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, could penetrate up to 140 millimeters of steel at 1,000 yards. Later, the APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot version, pushed that even further, capable of breaching a Panther's frontal armor at nearly 2 kilometers. The gun's sheer power came with cost. Recoil forces were enormous, requiring reinforced mounts and counterweights. The barrel was so long that it made the Sherman's profile distinctive, a beacon for German gunners. Firing the weapon illuminated the battlefield at night with a brief, violent flash that gave the Firefly its name. But the engineering brilliance lay in compromise. How to fit such power into a tank never designed for it. British engineers shortened the recoil system, rotated the breech, and removed the gunner's periscope. They sacrificed comfort and simplicity for performance. The result was a weapon that transformed the Sherman from prey to predator. The Firefly's long barrel became a symbol, a statement that industrial pragmatism could challenge German perfectionism. Where the Tiger was built with precision and arrogance, the Firefly was built with urgency and ingenuity. One took years to perfect, the other took months to adapt. But on the battlefield, they met as equals. The psychological angle, courage in a death trap. Every Firefly crew knew that. Despite its gun, they were still inside a Sherman, thinly armored and vulnerable. A single hit could ignite its fuel or ammunition, turning it into what Germans mockingly called a Tommy cooker. Crews nicknamed it Ronson. It lit first time, every time. To fight inside one required a kind of fatalism. Crews painted names on their tanks: Velvet, Alakifek, Caribou's Revenge, as if giving them souls might offer protection. Some carried lucky charms, Others wrote letters before every mission, knowing many would never be sent. The Firefly's gun offered hope, but not safety. Many crews never survived their first engagement. Yet the knowledge that they could destroy a Tiger changed everything. It gave them purpose. For the first time since the Blitz, British soldiers felt they could stand on equal ground with the German war machine. That morale shift, subtle but profound, ran through every armored regiment. It wasn't just about killing tanks. It was about proving that courage and adaptation could outmatch fear and arrogance. In every hedgerow, every ruined village, that quiet defiance grew stronger. And as the Allies pushed toward the heart of France, another story was unfolding, seen through the eyes of those who once mocked the Sherman. The German perspective, confidence meets reality, to the German panzer crews of 1944. Battle was a science they had perfected. Their Tigers and Panthers were more than machines. They were embodiments of engineering pride and ideological supremacy. The 80mm gun on the Tiger. I could destroy any Allied tank before it even came within striking distance. German doctrine revolved around precision, coordination, and fear. In the early days of Normandy, that fear still held. Allied tank formations burned in open fields. Advancing columns were ambushed and annihilated. For SS tank officers, it was a familiar rhythm: aim, fire, advance. The Sherman was predictable. It always came in numbers, it always died in numbers. Then came the Firefly. The first reports were dismissed. A lucky shot, a fluke, propaganda. But soon, the evidence piled up. Panzer wrecks with holes clean through their frontal armor. Long-range kills that made no sense according to known Allied capabilities. SS unit logs from the 2nd Panzer Division in July 1944 noted, enemy tanks with unusually long guns capable of effective fire at 1,500 meters and beyond. For the first time, the Tiger's advantage was uncertain. The arrogance that had fueled the Panzer Corps began to fracture. Crews started scanning the horizon nervously, searching for the elongated barrel of a Firefly. Commanders warned that the long Sherman must be engaged first, a deadly acknowledgement that the hunters had become the hunted. By August, German propaganda stopped mocking the Sherman altogether. Fear had replaced laughter. The leadership angle, visionaries behind the Iron Wars, are not won by weapons alone. They are won by the people who see what must be done before it's too late. For Britain, that vision came from men like Lieutenant Colonel Witheridge, the one-legged veteran who refused to accept defeat after North Africa. He argued that the Allies didn't need a new tank. They needed a new gun. His persistence, joined with the technical audacity of engineers like George Brighty and the logistical pragmatism of the British War Office, made the Firefly possible. Their American counterparts were slower to adapt, but they too began to evolve. General Omar Bradley, observing early Firefly performance in Normandy, reportedly noted, "The British have made something of our tank that we should have." That realization would later influence U.S. tank design, leading to the development of the M26 Pershing, America's late-war answer to German armor. Leadership during this period meant more than issuing orders. It meant admitting flaws, embracing innovation, and trusting men in the field to shape survival through improvisation. The Firefly story is not one of command decisions alone, but of the quiet defiance of engineers and mechanics who refused to wait for permission. In the end, their stubbornness changed the battlefield and the course of the war in the West. The moral angle, innovation born of necessity. The Firefly was never meant to exist. It was an act of desperation, a product of human fear, ingenuity, and the will to endure. In that sense, it symbolized the moral paradox of war, progress through suffering. Every improvement in killing power was a response to failure. The British only created the Firefly because so many Shermans had burned. Each modification represented the ghosts of the men who never came home. Yet within that tragedy lay something deeply human: resilience. The Firefly was proof that when pressed to the edge, people could adapt faster than any ideology could dictate. It wasn't built by propaganda or pride, but by necessity. It didn't glorify war. It survived it. This was the moral heartbeat of Allied warfare in 1944, a coalition that learned, adapted, and evolved. Where Germany built perfect machines to express dominance, the Allies built imperfect ones that could be repaired, modified, and multiplied. That difference, moral as much as mechanical, defined the rest of the campaign. In the ruins of Europe, it would be this adaptability, not perfection, that triumphed. The symbolic angle, the firefly as a turning point in every war. A single weapon often becomes a symbol, not for its design, but for what it represents. For the Allies, the firefly stood as a promise that the tide was turning. Its long barrel became a psychological weapon. Even when outnumbered, British and Commonwealth tank crews carried a quiet confidence, knowing they had the range and the power to kill first. Photographs from Normandy show fireflies parked beside their standard Sherman companions, almost identical except for that striking gun. It was a reminder that victory didn't always come from starting over, but from improving what already existed. The firefly embodied that philosophy, evolution under fire. To German troops, it became a symbol of the crumbling myth of invincibility. To Allied soldiers, it was the proof that courage could be engineered. The firefly wasn't the most famous weapon of the war. It wasn't the most produced or the most advanced, but it was one of the most decisive, because it changed how men thought about fighting. It taught that the battlefield could be turned not by numbers or prestige, but by understanding, adaptation, and precision. And on a quiet June morning in Normandy, when one SS officer laughed at the sight of yet another Sherman, that lesson was about to be taught in fire and smoke. June 9, 1944. Just outside Villers-Bocage, the war was changing, though few realized it yet. The hedgerows of Normandy hid an entire theater of ambushes. Each field was a fortress, each lane a death trap. British and German armor hunted one another in close quarters, invisible until the first flash of fire. It was early morning when the firefly of Sergeant Joe Ekins and the Northamptonshire Yeomanry rolled into position on a small rise near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil. Below them stretched open farmland, and beyond that a tree line where German armor had been sighted moving east. Among them, reports said, were Tigers of the SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 101, the same unit commanded by Michael Wittmann, the legendary Panzer ace of the Third Reich. The Firefly crew dug in, using the hedge as natural cover. The gunner, Ekins, adjusted the elevation. His commander, Lieutenant G.K. Henry, scanned the horizon through binoculars. They had orders to hold fire unless absolutely certain. Minutes passed. Then shapes emerged through the haze. Dark silhouettes, angular, crawling out of the morning mist. Tigers. The Firefly waited. Each German tank lumbered into the open, their turrets gliding with mechanical calm. At this distance, over 1,800 meters, a normal Sherman would never even attempt a shot. But this was not a normal Sherman. Lieutenant Henry gave a single word. Fire. The first round cracked through the still air, a streak of light that crossed the field faster than thought. Through the gunner's sight, Ekins saw the tracer vanish into the side of the lead Tiger. A heartbeat later, flame erupted from the hull. The turret lifted slightly prone, then collapsed in silence. The German column halted. Confusion rippled through the formation. Ekins reloaded. The second shot struck the second Tiger square in the turret ring. A perfect hit. Metal tore like paper. Smoke boiled from the hatch. The third Tiger tried to pivot, its 80mm gun searching for the invisible threat. Ekins fired again, 2,000 yards. The round struck the side armor and detonated inside. The explosion tore the turret apart. 3 Tigers destroyed in 12 minutes. It was not just an engagement. It was a revelation. German crews had believed themselves untouchable beyond 1,500 meters. Now they were dying before they could even identify their attacker. Radio chatter filled the ether with panic. Orders were shouted, positions abandoned. The SS units began to withdraw toward the woods, firing blindly. From his observation post, an SS officer watched through his binoculars. He had laughed earlier that morning when reports came in of Shermans on the ridge. He wasn't laughing now. The field below him was burning, the smell of fuel and smoke mingling with the distant cries of wounded men. The Firefly crew remained motionless, scanning for movement. Their hearts pounded, but their training held. They had witnessed something historic, not in glory, but in proof. The Sherman, long mocked as inferior, had just annihilated the most feared tanks in Europe at nearly twice the expected range. The German myth of armored supremacy, that carefully built illusion of invulnerability had cracked, open in the morning sun. For the men inside the Firefly, it wasn't triumph they felt. It was disbelief, then relief, then a solemn silence. They had done their job. But the echoes of those shots traveled far beyond that French field. Allied radio networks soon carried word of the encounter. Commanders listened in awe as reports confirmed. 3 Tigers destroyed by 1 Sherman Firefly. Range approximately 2,000 yards. It was no propaganda, it was fact. And as the British pushed deeper into the countryside, other Firefly crews began to repeat the feat. German tanks were no longer gods of the battlefield. They were targets within reach by nightfall. The wrecks of blackened Tigers lay smoldering across the hedgerows, monuments to arrogance undone by adaptation. The battlefield had shifted. In the days that followed, the name Firefly would spread through every Allied regiment, a whispered legend born from the thunder of that single morning. The SS officers, once so sure of their mechanical superiority, began issuing new orders: avoid open ground, fear the long-barreled Shermans. The laughter that once echoed across the fields of France had turned into silence. Silence broken only by the crack of a British gun that had rewritten the balance of power. And yet, that day's battle was not the end, only the beginning of a turning tide that would sweep across Normandy and into the heart of Germany itself. Because once the Allies proved they could kill the Tiger, they would never stop. In the aftermath of the engagement near Saint-Aignan-de-Craminil, the fields of Normandy lay scarred, blackened wrecks marking the end of German armored invincibility. But for the SS Panzer Corps, disbelief turned quickly into grim awareness. Reports of Firefly strikes flooded command posts. What was once dismissed as isolated luck now had pattern and precision. By mid-July 1944, the 2nd Panzer Division and SS Panzer Lehr Division had begun to rewrite their field tactics. Where once they engaged openly, confident in their frontal armor, they now hesitated, seeking concealment, limiting exposure, avoiding direct duels. The very doctrine of blitzkrieg, built on momentum and visibility, began to falter under the pressure of an enemy that could now shoot farther, faster, and more accurately. The battlefield had changed, and with it, the psychology of war. At dawn near Villers-Bocage, another Firefly, commanded by Sergeant Gordon and his Canadian crew from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, took up a defensive position along a hedgerow. The terrain was suffocating, thick bocage that turned every engagement into a duel at knife's edge. German Panthers prowled the opposite lanes, their engines growling low, searching for movement. Through the periscope, Gordon spotted a shadow between the trees, a glint of armor, a turning turret. The Firefly waited. The moment the Panther edged forward, its flank exposed for less than 3 seconds, Gordon gave the order. Fire. The shot roared through the hedgerow, leaves and dust exploding around the barrel. The round struck home. The Panther's side armor peeled open, fire bursting from its vents. German infantry scattered, stunned by the power of a gun they had thought belonged only to anti-tank batteries. Every successful hit reverberated far beyond the immediate destruction. The German high command soon realized they could no longer rely on the dominance of their heavy armor to control engagements. They began to adapt, reluctantly, defensively. The SS Panzer units around Caen started deploying in tighter formations, using infantry screens and night movements. Tank duels became rarer, ambushes more frequent. For the first time, German tanks feared exposure. On the Allied side, morale surged. Crews who once whispered prayers before facing a Tiger now approached combat with steely focus. Reports tell of commanders deliberately baiting German armor, sending standard Shermans forward as decoys while Fireflies waited camouflaged behind hedgerows or in the ruins of barns. It was a reversal of power that played out not just in tactics, but in psychology. One British officer described it best in his diary. The Tiger has ceased to be a monster. It bleeds now as we do. That single shift in mindset, from terror to determination, transformed the campaign. The Allies no longer advanced cautiously through the bocage. They hunted. Fireflies became the spearhead of every armored troop. When reports of German armor came in, commanders didn't call for airstrikes. They called for Fireflies. In engagements near Caen, Hill 112 and Bourguebus Ridge, Firefly units accounted for the destruction of dozens of Tigers and Panthers. Even the famed SS Tiger ace Michael Whitman fell in the same campaign, his tank obliterated by Allied fire, possibly from a Firefly or a combination of anti-tank fire. His death marked more than the loss of a hero to Germany. It symbolized the end of German armored invincibility. After Villers-Bocage, the Germans still fought fiercely, but their confidence was gone. Allied forces, now equipped and emboldened, began to break through their defensive lines with momentum unseen since the early war years. The Firefly had achieved something no doctrine or speech could. It restored belief, and that belief translated into action. From July to August 1944, the British and Canadian armored divisions pushed south, smashing German positions in Operations Goodwood and Totalize. The Firefly's long-range precision tore open enemy armor concentrations, paving the way for infantry and air support to finish what the guns began. The numbers tell their own story. In less than 2 months, over 300 German tanks were destroyed or abandoned across Normandy. Many fell to air attacks, but a significant number, confirmed by post-war reports, were killed by Fireflies engaging from distances that the Germans had once considered impossible. The laughter that once echoed from German positions was gone, replaced by a new sound, the hiss of fear in the radio channels, the shouts of officers ordering retreats from unseen guns. For years, the Allies had lived under the shadow of the Tiger. Now, it was the Germans who fought in the shadow of the Firefly. Yet for all its triumph, the Firefly's legacy was not one of glory, but of grim necessity. It was not a tank of conquest, but of correction, a weapon born from imbalance, wielded by men who had known defeat and refused to repeat it. By late August, as the German lines began to collapse around Falaise, British and Canadian tankers advanced past burning wrecks of once feared panzers. The Firefly had done its work. The road to Paris lay open. The war was far from over, but the myth of German invincibility had been buried in the hedgerows of Normandy, under smoke, steel, and silence. And from that silence rose a new truth. The Allies could outshoot the masters. The Tiger was no longer king. By late August 1944, the landscape of Normandy was a graveyard of armor. Burnt Tigers and Panthers lined the hedgerows, black hulks stripped of their menace. Villagers whispered that even the mighty panzers bled in those fields. For the Allies, the psychological weight of victory was immense. When the first after-action reports reached London and Washington, disbelief turned to astonishment. Intelligence officers cross-checked the data. Sherman Fireflies had achieved confirmed kills on Tigers and Panthers at ranges between 1,500 and 2,000 yards, something previously thought impossible. The figures were cold, but they carried an emotional truth. The balance of the tank war in Western Europe had shifted. British Army records show that by the end of the Normandy campaign, Fireflies were responsible for more than half of all German tank losses inflicted by British and Canadian units. Their accuracy and killing power forced the Germans into increasingly defensive postures. No longer could the Wehrmacht rely on its armored spearhead to punch through Allied lines. Now it struggled to defend its own. The impact was immediate and measurable. German commanders began issuing revised tactics. Orders from Panzergruppe West emphasized concealment, rapid withdrawal, and avoidance of long-range duels with enemy tanks possessing superior reach. Even the mighty Tiger II, the King Tiger, was forced to adapt. Its crews were told to engage only from ambush positions and to avoid open fields where Fireflies could dominate. But beyond the tactical reports, there were the men. The crews who had lived the terror of facing Tigers now carried themselves differently. Letters sent home by British and Canadian tankers began to sound less like confessions of survivors and more like statements of purpose. "We're not the hunted anymore," one sergeant wrote. "They're the ones who hide now." For the first time in years, Allied morale in the armored divisions soared. The myth of German mechanical superiority, nurtured since 1939, had been shattered. The Tiger, once the nightmare of Allied tankers, had been reduced to a vulnerable machine of bolts and steel like any other. Yet the triumph came with a cost. The Firefly, for all its power, was still a Sherman underneath, thinly armored, vulnerable to mines, artillery, and aircraft. In every squadron that boasted victories, there were burned-out husks of Fireflies that never returned. German gunners learned to identify the elongated barrel instantly, prioritizing it as their first target. A single high-velocity shell could still end 5 lives in a heartbeat. Even so, the calculus had changed. Allied forces were now advancing faster than the Germans could reorganize. In the weeks following the Falaise pocket, British and Canadian divisions surged east toward the Seine, while American units broke through at Avranches. Behind the advance rolled columns of fireflies. Their crews hardened, their reputations growing. To the Germans, these tanks were ghosts, striking from afar, disappearing before counterfire. To the Allies, they were saviors. Infantrymen cheered when they saw the long-barreled Shermans taking up overwatch. Air spotters began coordinating their movements around firefly positions, using them as anchors for advancing lines. By the time Paris was liberated in late August, the firefly had earned its place not just as a weapon, but as a symbol, proof that the Allies could innovate under fire, that courage and engineering could overcome fear and myth. But as the Allies celebrated, planners were already looking ahead. They knew Germany's heartland still lay ahead, and that beyond the Siegfried Line waited newer, deadlier tanks. The Firefly had bought time and parity. Now it would be tested again, across rivers, forests, and the frozen fields of the Ardennes. The age of Allied inferiority was over. The age of relentless advance had begun. By the autumn of 1944, the reputation of the Sherman Firefly had spread through every armored unit in Western Europe. It was no longer a curiosity or an improvised solution. It was a cornerstone of Allied armored warfare. Production accelerated. Conversion workshops across Britain and liberated France worked day and night to modify standard Shermans into Fireflies. By the end of the year, over 20,100 Fireflies were in service with British, Canadian, Polish, and New Zealand units. The gun that had once been too big for the Sherman had become the most feared Allied weapon on land. Every battlefield told its story. At Nijmegen, Fireflies covered the bridges during Operation Market Garden, knocking out Panthers at near maximum range. In the Ardennes, during the freezing winter of 1944-45, they fought in snow and silence against the final German counterattack. Their long barrels, wrapped in rags to hide the shine, watched over roads choked with smoke and frost. But even as they continued to kill, engineers and commanders began to see the limits of the design. The Firefly was powerful, yes, but it was also a stopgap. The cramped turret, awkward loading position, and towering barrel made it hard to handle in close combat. Its ammunition was heavy, its recoil punishing, and for all its lethality, it still shared the Sherman's fundamental flaw: thin armor. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the Firefly's role began to fade. The next generation of tanks, the American M26 Pershing and the British Comet, had arrived, combining heavy armor with high-velocity guns inspired by the Firefly's success. What had begun as an improvised fix had evolved into a design philosophy: firepower first, mobility second, production always. Post-war analysis confirmed what many crews already knew. The Firefly had been one of the most effective tank conversions of the war. It accounted for a disproportionate share of German tank losses compared to its numbers. Its cost was low, its performance decisive. The British Army would continue to use Fireflies into the late 1940s, even as new designs replaced them. But beyond the statistics, its legacy was human. The men who crewed them remembered not the engineering but the feeling, that for once they held a weapon capable of fighting back. In interviews decades later, veterans spoke of the first time they saw a Tiger burn. It wasn't revenge, one said. It was relief. We knew we could finally stop running. On the German side, captured reports from 1944-45 tell a different story, one of confusion and respect. The phrase Lang Sherman, Long Sherman, appears repeatedly in Wehrmacht documents, often accompanied by warnings. Engage only at close range. Use concealment. Do not underestimate. The laughter that had once greeted Allied tanks had vanished entirely. The Firefly didn't just kill tanks. It killed an illusion. It proved that adaptability could triumph over arrogance, and that quantity, when guided by ingenuity, could defeat quality bound by pride. In the aftermath of the war, its influence lingered in the DNA of every modern tank. The British Centurion, born in 1945, carried the Firefly spirit, a balanced mix of mobility, firepower, and survivability. The Americans, too, learned their lesson. Never again would they enter a war with a tank that couldn't face its enemy on equal terms. Today, surviving Fireflies stand silent in museums and memorials across Europe, at Bovington, at Bayeux, at the fields of Normandy where they once burned and triumphed. Visitors walk past their long barrels and narrow hulls, unaware perhaps of what those machines meant to the men inside them. They were not perfect. They were not invincible, but they changed everything, because for the first time in years, Allied tankers could look across a battlefield and not feel fear, but determination, and in that shift of spirit, the outcome of the war was already decided. The war in Europe ended less than a year after the Firefly's debut. By the spring of 1945, Berlin lay in ruins, and the tanks that had once defined terror stood silent, relics of a fading empire. Among the wreckage were Shermans, Fireflies, and Panzers alike, all reduced to equal silence beneath the same gray sky. But history remembers them differently. The Tiger represented power, the embodiment of German engineering and hubris. The Firefly represented something quieter, adaptation, defiance, and the ability to turn failure into strength. The Firefly was never meant to exist. It was an act of necessity, born from desperation and held together by courage and creativity. Yet that improvised machine changed the trajectory of the war. In the hands of ordinary men, it shattered an empire built on the illusion of superiority. Its story is not one of glory, but of resilience, of soldiers who refused to surrender to inevitability. Every shot fired from its 17-pounder was more than metal against armor. It was a statement that no force, however mighty, is beyond the reach of ingenuity and resolve. In the decades since, the Firefly's legacy has faded into the larger history of the war, overshadowed by newer machines and greater battles. Yet its echo endures, in every weapon designed with balance over excess, function over perfection. On a quiet morning, in the orchards of Normandy where the dew still clings to the grass, a few of those tanks remain, rusted, forgotten, but standing. The long barrel still points toward an empty horizon, silent testimony to the day the laughter stopped, and a myth was broken. For in that moment, when a single Sherman fired from 2,000 yards away, the world witnessed more than a tank duel. It witnessed the triumph of adaptation over arrogance, of courage over fear, of men who refused to believe that invincibility was absolute. The Firefly's flash lit more than the battlefield that morning. It illuminated the path to victory,